Panel number 3, America's Got Talent, Skilling and Upskilling Your Current STEM Workforce. Deliverables to transform and give practical solutions to skilling and upskilling existing employees, further career advancement while sustainably elevating a company's STEM capabilities. I'd welcome our panel to the stage as I introduce Megan Murphy, editor of Bloomberg Businessweek. Megan has been... That's pretty good. In addition to being editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, she has chaired or been with the Washington bureau chief at the Financial Times, where she launched its award-winning FAST FT digital platform. She also served as the law courts correspondent, investment banking correspondent, and chief media correspondent. More about Megan can be found at page 19 of your program. So Megan, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, and such a pleasure to be here this morning, particularly with such a distinguished panel of guests who I'll introduce now. This is Jen Granner from Experius. We've got Krishna Nathan of S&P Global. Got Jane Oates of Apollo. Uh-oh, sorry. That's not very good. I know, right?
The music comes on.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that was last year.
And Matt Stiegelman from Birding, the CEO of Birding Glass Technologies. We're thrilled to be here. As he said, I'm the editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, and we spend a ton of time at... There we go, yay. We spent a ton of time writing and thinking about this issue. It's an issue I'm personally deeply passionate about on many, many levels, looking at how we reformulate our labor force and our educational system to make our workforce capable for really achieving the jobs and delivering on the jobs we need for the next 10 years, not the last 10 years. We spent a lot of time talking about this issue, and what I'm really excited about with this panel this morning, we've talked about in our pre-calls, is actually giving some practical solutions and talking about what's working and talking about where we see opportunity and where we see challenges and where we can see we can really move this debate forward. And so I'm going to start with that. So Jen, I'm going to start with you. When we talk about skilling, upskilling, reskilling America's workforce, I love America's Got Talent. I think this is what this one is called. But where do you see from your experience, in your position, what's working and where we have room to grow, but where you really find initiatives that either in-house or going externally for training or bringing that training in-house? What are companies doing and can do to really get the results they want on delivering the crucial reskilling they need in STEM?
You know, that's a great question, Megan, and I think something that is so important as we enter this skills revolution is to realize that the way our future talent learns is very different. And we have to take a look at learnability. We have to take a look at the passion and the desire to learn new things very quickly. And as organizations, we have to take a look at changing our training and ensuring that we are not only assessing our current talent and taking a look at what they bring to the table, but then how do we create training programs that are then in line with how they learn. So something that Manpower has created is an online assessment tool called LQ, and it's the learnability quotient. And what this does is it allows you to take a look at somebody's learnability and how they learn. And so as the organization is going through transformation and you have a group of individuals that are great for the organization and have high learnability, but maybe aren't skilled up for the future of your workforce, you need to take a look at how do you quickly skill them up and bring that training in-house. We will actually doing something similar over in Europe, and we'll hopefully bring it to the US very soon. And we were working with a manufacturing firm that had textile workers that were the skills were just going away. And so what we did is we partnered with the technical colleges and the government, and we took a look at how do we take these skilled workers where their current skills weren't relevant anymore, and take them and partner with the education systems and put them in within the new skills that are coming in. And we gave them the learnability test and figured out how they learn, and were able to create skilled training programs that were specific to them.
Krishna, picking up on some of that for you, you were at IBM for many, many years, more than 2 decades, I think it was, in a variety of roles. You only recently came to S&P Global. You've been there, what, about a year now? So that shift from sort of the tech sector and what people traditionally conceptualize as the tech sector, where STEM is sort of omnipresent, and then moving to S&P, you know, a financial ratings firm, a financial services firm, where have you noticed in terms of the skills gap or the ability to recruit the necessary skills you need, or the training differences that you've seen? What are sort of the contrasts that you've seen moving from traditional tech, big tech, to financial services?
So if you look at a traditional financial services company like us, you know, we work in the capital markets, the commodity markets, and if you ask yourself, so what are the areas of STEM that are important to us? I break it down to 3 categories. The cloud, and sort of everything around that, and I'll talk about that in a second. Cybersecurity, this is of huge importance. And the third thing is everything that's commonly called around big data, but if you peel the onion, you've got machine learning, artificial intelligence, so on and so forth, right? And the 3 of them, they're different aspects of the larger STEM problem. If you look at cloud, it's essentially, as almost everyone in this room would recognize, it's a way of computing the same way that when PCs and computers came about, you put certain things aside and you went off to do this. So in this case, the reskilling comes not so much from, hey, if you don't go to the cloud, your job's going to disappear. The reskilling and the upskilling comes from the fact that it's almost a question of, this is where the innovation's happening. So if I want to be at the forefront of what I do, whatever it is, right? If I'm the person running infrastructure within the company, I just need to pick up these new sets of skills because that's where it's happening. And that's where the innovation is, and I want to be part of that innovation, and so therefore, you know, that's the way to get them to do this. If you look at something like big data, this is just fundamental to how we operate now. The plethora of data, different sources of data, being able to do this analysis for our clients and all these sorts of things adds additional business value. And if we didn't have a workforce that understood this, that didn't have a workforce that knew what the implications of this were, we just wouldn't be able to provide that value. So once again, you can sort of take the view, for example, on machine learning and automation, that, oh, the sky is falling and all our jobs are going to be eliminated and we're all going to be sitting there just looking at machines do these things. But there's a flip side to this, right? The flip side to it is that, and this is where once again the upskilling comes in, there's a whole new set of things that are enabled. And these are just tools, the same way that the computer was a tool, the same way that electricity displaced steam engines and a whole bunch of things happened. So for us, those are the 3 areas. And the way we think about this is a new set of skills are required, but they're required as part of what you need to do for your job. It's not some sort of a sea change that's happening, and if you don't do this, the sky is falling.
Yeah, I mean, most surveys actually show that, particularly in the manufacturing and industrial sector, most believe that automation will increase the number of job opportunities, and very few surveys show that people actually think they'll lead to an immediate decrease in workers. We were just looking at China and their expansion into automation and just how far they have to go. They have about 50 robots per every 10,000 workers, whereas Germany already has 350 robots for every 100,000 workers, and they're pushing in sort of how this affects their dynamic. But speaking of big data, I'm skipping over you, Jane, for now. I'm going to Matt. Matt, this is your whole company, is analyzing big data and looking for these trends and really hitting on where we can match up what employers are looking for in STEM and how we actually get it so that we can better equip students, other people in the workforce to be ready for those opportunities. What are the big trends you've seen that have surprised you or that you find that are accelerating right now when you look at, what is it, some crazy amount of job listings a day?
So, what we're finding as one of the most powerful forces in the job market today, which certainly is absolutely at the center of the discussion around STEM, is that we are seeing jobs essentially merging, having sex, if you will, in ways and at a pace that they never have before. So we're seeing whole sets of skills that never rode together, if you will, merging into the same jobs. What that means in the STEM context, of course, when you think about the kinds of skills or the kinds of technology sets that Krishna was just describing, is that they are there's coming to be a wide dispersion of those skills in the job market, to the point that the discussion really is less and less, or ought to be less and less, about STEM jobs and more about STEM skills. You know, to put just a few examples around that. I always, by the way, like to talk about the M in STEM. Usually when we think about math jobs, we think about jobs as actuaries or the like. Yes, and about 2.5 million others. So when you look at, we recently completed a report together with partners at IBM, tracking demand for data science and analytic skills. And again, about 2.5 million jobs last year. But the fascinating thing about them is that 2/3 of those jobs are not data science jobs. They are jobs in marketing, they're jobs in life science, they're jobs in a whole host of places where people need to make decisions and are depending on data and are being called on to have the skills to do it. Now, similarly, by the way, in terms of coding skills, if you look at top quartile earning jobs, which by the way sounds highfalutin, that means you make $55,000 a year. 49% of jobs in that top quartile are in occupations where a decent percentage of them are asking for coding skills. So what we're seeing is, on the one hand, a significant challenge for learners and workers, because if you don't have those skills, then you know, you're increasingly in the digital have-nots bucket. On the other hand, what it means is significant disruption for those of us in this room in terms of our supply chains for talent. Because the typical organs of supply, whether it be training institutions, whether it be more often higher education institutions, are developing their programs around traditional definitions of jobs. So when you think about training programs for non-STEM jobs, they don't tend to include training for STEM skills. And so a lot of the work that we're doing increasingly is with companies and helping them track disruption, track where they're likely to see these kinds of emerging skills upend the apple cart, if you will. Second, in being able to map the genome of those jobs so that they can identify alternative talent pools that may be easier, cheaper, or sometimes more diverse sources of talent. And third, to them being able to map career pathways and supply chains to tap those alternative talent pools.
Well, you just hit right there on sort of the nub of this, and a perfect segue into you, Jane. You know, Matt just was saying there that the educational system is still formulated in some respects around the traditional conception of a job, whether it's STEM or non-STEM, just in how they, instead of thinking about every job as a STEM job in some capacity. I think it was Matt that recently, I think it was you guys that recently did a survey talking about liberal arts majors. I was a liberal arts major. And just how if they graft on a few STEM skills, even perhaps in the way how they describe it, whether it's data analytics, et cetera, that bolsters their career prospects and also their earning prospects quite dramatically coming out of secondary education. Jane, in your experience with Apollo and what you guys have done, where are you focusing your efforts in STEM? Where do you think that is the most change is needed? How much is online learning, online courses really going to move the needle, not even just for sort of that traditional cohort of university, but secondary learners, people further along the age spectrum as well?
So I think the change is fundamental, and I think the higher ed institutions that don't incorporate some of these changes are going to be extinct. You know, I think they're going to go away in the next 10 years, particularly the non-tier ones. So what do I think the big changes are? There's no more silos. You can't be, you know, a major that learns how to crunch numbers without learning how to create a message and move that message. There's no place in business anymore for just a number cruncher who can't articulate what they're doing. If you take it to what Krishna was saying, you know, data analytics is something that the University of Phoenix has looked at and has encouraged through work with STEMCONNECTOR and other institutions to look at. Yes, there are data scientists, but unless CEOs understand the right questions to ask, they send the data scientists down a rabbit hole because it doesn't help them in database decision making. So I think that's a huge change. Break down the silos, have many more majors that are allowed to take 3 from column A and 3 from column B in terms of creating a course sequence that prepares them more adequately for the jobs. But I think equally, you know, I spend a lot of my time talking to business, and HR directors have to change too. They have learned a ladder mentality. You start at this job and you're going to move up the ladder. Today it's a lattice. You need to look at different places within your company for talent because of the online opportunities, many of them free, where people can experiment with things like coding. They can take a course in data analytics. It doesn't appear on their resume, but they have that skill. And I think that's what was very interesting about what Jen was talking about, this assessment. How do you make sure you can recognize talent regardless of the job title that it's in internally, and then move them across in a very different path? I think that's how successful companies are going to operate in the 21st century. It's not going to be, you know, a linear path anymore. It's going to be circuitous.
But Jen, picking up on that, that is difficult. You know, companies are not structured right now to do this kind of talent assessment and find hidden pots of gold where they haven't traditionally looked, frankly. I mean, you know, my own industry aside, sort of every industry, but how can we enable companies, which is unlocking this talent, which may be stuck doing something different, giving them the skills they need to equip. How can we better equip from the CEO level on down to identify and spot those opportunities among their existing work pool?
You know, it's a challenge, right? I think there's 2 things that are very, very important to think about with the education piece and the corporation piece. I'm going to tie this back to a grassroots effort that we did in Minnesota, where we went and we took 30 girls and we put them in a room and talked to them about how they make their decisions as they're going through education. So this was 5th, 8th, and 11th grade girls. And their decisions were made based on exposure and awareness and hands-on, like the millennials were saying yesterday. And we had executives, CIOs, CEOs in the room talking to these girls, and not only were the girls then getting awareness to what the corporations had, the corporations were getting awareness to how they needed to change and evolve to make sure that they're creating their future based upon what the future talent needs. So I think it's exposure and awareness on both sides. Something else that we've done, and this takes the education piece and the corporation world together and partners them, is we brought the girls out to do tours with these large organizations. One is a huge healthcare company, and they have an innovation center, and we brought the girls on a tour. And the executives that were giving the tour, as they were talking to the girls, and the girls were looking at the heat maps and the data and everything that this innovation center had to show, the executives were going, wow, here we are, we have all this to give, and we haven't been giving exposure, right, to the future talent. One of the girls had said, this is geography, like these heat maps, this is part of STEM. I love geography. I didn't have any idea that geography was part of STEM. So to that point, I think we as organizations need to be more connected to the millennials and to that point, even the younger talent. It starts in 5th grade. And so if we can ensure that we are bringing the younger talent into our organizations and asking them the questions, STEMCONNECTOR getting the millennials involved is brilliant, right? This is what's going to close the gap. We need to get their ideas, bring them in, and potentially even have corporations part of the education system at an earlier age. Maybe 9th grade, part of education is the corporations are actually doing the teaching. And it has to start before the secondary before you move on to college?
So I spent most of my career, and in fact, much of my adult life, in London and in Europe, where things like apprenticeships, vocational training is much more part of the fabric of the system in terms of, and one of the things with STEM, whether you have vocational and sort of much more entrenched apprenticeship culture, is that there is almost forced exposure to fields at a younger age. And Christian, I know you've been involved in particularly younger girls as well, and getting them exposed and sort of in some small initiatives. My concern is always not the fifth, is the dropout level then in high school and college among women, among minorities that we see. We're looking at a company called Rockwell Automation this week, and one of the ways they've been able to diversify their engineering staff is frankly to make a predominantly white male workforce take courses on how to adapt to a diversifying workforce and how successful that's been for them. Where do you see the challenges in terms of getting this, whether it's girls, whether it's minorities, to expose them early and keep them vested in developing STEM careers?
So there are a couple of facets to this, right? One, you mentioned mentoring. So things like, girls in technology, virtual classrooms, and we're part of a program where we mentor about 350 girls in high schools, and we have volunteers across the company who do this online, right? And I think mentoring is important because it gives this more of a one-to-one, if you will. It can be virtual, this relationship between what a career in STEM might look like, what I need, so on and so forth. I think another aspect is, and I know both of you talked about it also, is this notion of exposure. Not all jobs will be STEM jobs, but in the same fashion that I don't need to be an accountant or a financial planner to understand that I should balance my checkbook, or what it means, what are the consequences of certain financial decisions. The exposure to these things allows not just junior people in the workforce, but senior people to ask the right kinds of questions, because they need to know that this sort of data is available. So they may not be a data scientist, but they need to have the exposure to this to do this, to ask those questions. So I think peripherally, getting exposure is really important. And the third thing, which I don't know if we spend enough time on, is the educator aspect of it. You asked the question in terms of what makes kids in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grades, very impressionable period, either be attracted to STEM or stay with it. And I think a tremendous amount of that has to do with the teachers. And a personal experience, I remember in 7th grade, or 8th grade, I can't remember, it was a long time ago. I had a terrible math teacher. And it would have totally turned me off of math, but for the fact that my sister, who till today is a mathematician, and she was sort of said, hey, this is really cool and you do this. But so I think we need to think more about how we get the right people in those early stages. I mean, it's all great about getting the kids and mentoring them, but we should be thinking about, should we be mentoring some of those educators as well, and having role models for them outside of the education area, role models, people like us in this room, people like us up on the stage, because I think that's the spark that in a lot of times really gets things going.
Yes, thank you to my 9th grade geometry teacher for the reason I'm a journalist today. Big shout out to her. But Jane, I mean, this draws right into your sweet spot in terms of both looking at women, looking at fields, but also looking at the role of educators. One thing I'm fascinated about is, when we talk about, again, skilling up as a, not just getting in, but then constantly reinventing, constantly reskilling in STEM, and how crucial that is, and where employers and employees can go to get these skills and to really prioritize it in the workforce, and not just fall down this trajectory of one career, one job, one motion. How can we get educators more consistently involved in some cases in people, in employees' lives?
So I think that businesses really have to look at what are the right things for them to do internally, and what are the right things to bring educators in on. I mean, there's many educators in this room who would be value added all the time, from Rob Denton to everybody else that's in here. But I think what's really promising is when you can educate an incumbent worker on site, give them not only the technical skills or the academic skills that they need, but also the secret sauce of the company where it's done in kind of collusion, so it's not one or the other, it's both. And I am not the demographic for this, clearly, but I am a huge fan of immersion models like boot camps. And full disclosure, I am associated with Iron Yard, but I think that what they can do in a deep dive immersion program with coding languages, with cybersecurity, with app development, in a cohort that's small, that's aligned with the company. What they're doing is amazing. I won't name any of the companies for fear that I will name them incorrectly, but these people have brought Iron Yard in to do, during the workday, an immersive experience to have them transition from Python to Ruby on Rails or whatever. They don't miss their work. The company doesn't miss any efficiency. And the workers are thrilled to learn with people that they'll be implementing what they learned with on the job next week. So I think these models, and I think IT is a great place for it to start. As somebody who is surprised not a digital native, for me, that would be very attractive. I don't want to go off-site to a college that may teach me conceptually what I have to learn and then go back to work and have my manager say, you understand the concept, but you don't know how to operationalize it. So I think this is going to happen in cyber. I think it's going to happen in data analytics. And I think more colleges have to wake up to that and steal this deep dive immersion, very focused thing, and steal the ideas from the boot camps for other things, because I think it's the wave of the future.
Matt, that draws right in. We've been talking about millennials. We talked about millennials a lot this morning and the crucialness of bridging that gap as you described. What are you seeing, Matt, in your data and your research in terms of millennials when they're coming out, in terms of these skills? How big a gap still remains? Are we doing enough to get that group of the population? Obviously, it's always going to trend higher towards STEM. It does trend higher towards STEM, just of the sort of revolution we've seen over the past 2 decades. But is it enough, and are they moving quickly enough as a population themselves to really seize up this opportunity and this mantle for how much that needs to change?
I think one of the big encumbrances that millennials face, or frankly all workers face coming into the workforce today, is the extent to which there is essentially, I think this is a STEM room, so I can use it in these terms, essentially a signal processing problem in the job market. So in order to be able to acquire the skills that are going to make you competitive in the market, you need to know what those skills are. So when people talk about a skill gap, we really need to think about it as an information gap. And I think for a lot of, in a lot of cases, we're finding that people have most of the skills they need, but are falling a little bit short. You mentioned, Megan, the work that we've done tracking, for example, opportunities for liberal arts grads. I'll give you an example, very concrete example. The average starting salary for a psych major, which is actually even maybe on the peripheries of STEM itself, is $42,000. Now, a lot of psych majors make the, they get this kind of weird advice that you should get a marketing certification. So psych people with marketing concentrations make about $38,000. Bad advice. On the other hand, a psych major who did maybe some statistical experiments, learned R or SAS or SPSS, has a starting salary of $64,000, right? So don't you wish you got that memo? And of course, unfortunately, for the most part, I guess they're not memos anymore. For the most part, that memo's not getting out. Schools themselves often are lacking those data, let alone students. So I think there's, that's why I really want to underscore the importance of what Jane described before, of thinking about this as a way that we work, the importance of essentially training our own workforces first. Because with your own workforce is one of the places where there is the most opportunity to avoid that signal distortion. Jane was just talking a minute ago about how important it is to provide opportunities for people to learn in their own workplace to acquire skills. But it's equally important for us as part of that to give clear guidance to workers, to say, here's the skills that we're looking for. You're tracking the market, and you can see the kind of emerging skill trends that are going to really matter. You can give that guidance fairly easily. Now, part of that means that you also need to track, again, if this is the genome of the jobs that are going to be important to us going forward, you can then map that genome back to other jobs that have some of the same skills, that you can actually very clearly say, hey, look, you've got a lot of these kinds of skills. Here's the specific skills you need to learn. One of the things that's nice about that, in addition to the fact that it's very clear and directive, is it avoids the problem that often exists of life getting in the way, right? We all know that one of the reasons why people drop out of school or they start courses and don't finish them is because life gets in the way. Well, if something is just an exercise in eating kale, something that you're supposed to do because it's supposed to be good for you or something like that, then it's easy for life to get in the way of kale. If it's something like, hey, Matt, we want you to move from making $20 an hour to $25 an hour. Here's what you need to learn, and here's an efficient, short-form way to learn it. That's going to be a lot more palatable and ultimately gets to one of the ways you solve the gender gap in STEM as well. I'll just end with a very clear, very quick example of that. Something we mapped for a company recently that was really trying to figure out how they could bring more gender diversity to some of their developer roles. And I'll give you the example of mobile app developers. Mobile app developers are 9% women. Web designers are 52% women. Now, it's not the same job by any stretch. But a web designer to a web developer is a discrete and doable, bridgeable step. By the way, web developers are 21% women. So right there, you went from 52 to 21. And from web developers to mobile app developers, again, not the same job, but a bridgeable step, gets you from 21% to 9%, or actually the reverse direction. So there are really, if we can map the genome of jobs and think about this as skills and give that clear guidance to workers, we can close these gaps.
I think the saddest part of that tale is that a psych major is infinitely more STEM than my American Studies major back in, so forward. Jane, let's take a step back and talk about some of what Matt was saying, but taking a step back. One of my biggest passions when I'm writing and looking at the kind of stories that we do and we choose to do is whether or not, we talked a lot about business and responsibility of business and the educational sector. Where is government's role in this? Are we really being honest with the workforce at a broad brush level when we talk about automation, when we talk about broad swaths of the economy? Are we being honest with people and saying, look, your jobs aren't coming back, but that's not because manufacturing has left or people have outsourced or left for other cheaper labor forces. They're gone because they simply don't exist anymore because robots are doing them. How much of a government imperative does there need to be from the top down about saying, look, this has got to be the structure moving forward, where STEM is at the core of our educational system moving forward. We're equipping workers for lifelong learning. We're going to give all the incentives we need to allow businesses to do it, but we're going to take really proactive steps that are bigger than what we're doing now, much bigger than what we're doing now in terms of really revolutionizing the way people think about work, they think about what jobs are, and they think about how they're going to lift themselves up the rungs economically and career-wise in a very different way than a lot of people look at it now.
So I'm going to sound a little bit bipolar when I give you my answer. First of all, I think government has a critical role to play in data collection. I think the idea that we're cutting back on organizations like BLS means that we'll never have any real-time data except with Matt. And even Matt relies very much on NCES data, IPEDS data, and BLS data. So I think government has to keep that role going. I also think that government has to keep creating tools like My Skills, My Future, My Next Move for veterans that are crosswalks, crosswalk IT tools that anybody can have access to. I also think government has an important role to incent certain things. So with the Department of Labor and the Department of Education, they can change the emphasis on STEM by saying, if you want this competitive grant money, you've got to make this change, higher ed institution. And then I think the Department of Treasury has huge power to do things that would incent business. I mean, I think you should be able to amortize your dollars that you spend on training just like you can your money on equipment. That you should have exactly the same tax benefit to invest in your workers as you do investing in your upgrading of machinery. But I also think that we have to be very careful, and I want to say that even, this is not because I work for the University of Phoenix, I think we have to be careful of governmental overreach in things like wage rules. Because there are certain careers. My son went to a nonprofit, very expensive university that would never meet the gainful employment measure. He's a journalist. He's never gonna, yeah, right. Unemployed more than he's employed. But I mean, the reality is $60,000 a year at his institution, he would never have met gainful. And that's a tale of woe for me personally. But think about the careers that we really value in this society. I'm a recovering teacher. When I started teaching in 1975, I made $8,000 a year. I would not have met gainful because even back then, $8,000 wouldn't have met what I paid at Boston College for tuition. So I think that we have to be very careful about those overreaches. I don't want a world where we don't have poets. I don't want a world where we don't have actors. I certainly don't want a world where we have underqualified Head Start teachers and early childhood teachers. So I think we have to, in the vise of doing good, getting the bad players out of education, we don't want to make everybody stop doing things that don't make the right salary 6 months or 12 months after graduation. So that's why I'm a little bipolar. I think government has a huge role to play, but I think we do have to be careful because there are places where through regulation they could overreach.
That's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about it in terms of the poets as well. Krishna, let's just go a bit deeper on this. When I look at this and we look at, drawing on both your sort of careers, your job now, and as a long-termer at IBM, how realistic is it for some parts of the workforce, for some parts of the areas of the country? I have a family business in Wisconsin. I go up there from time to time in very northwest Wisconsin. When the cheese factory closes, 50 jobs, the 50 high-paying jobs, 50 jobs paying $20 an hour, it is difficult for that workforce to train to get skills they would, even though this area of Wisconsin is becoming a bit of a tech center. It's a beautiful area of the country. It's right on a river. It's got a lot of tourism. It's got a lot of digital companies actually relocating there. How realistic is it that we can reach, whether it's rural, whether it's people who have to travel long distances, how much can online close that gap, and how much can stuff like AI and looking at this data really help with sort of moving that workforce or getting them, bringing the jobs to them, bringing the skills to them?
So, I think first of all, this discussion is much easier today than I think it would have been 20, 30 years ago, given with everything that's going online, all the availability of, open, MOOCs, right? Coursera, open courses, things like this. So there are things that one can do in terms of, which are really agnostic to whether it's a rural area, assuming you have a broadband connection, which in most places you do. So I think that is less of a handicap than it might have been. And it's really a question of awareness. I think this is a fundamental thing. And then there's also a cultural issue to this. And what do I mean by the cultural thing? One has to be comfortable with the notion of change, whether it's the cheese factory or whether it's the data worker doing something, in an office. So I think this notion of change is inevitable, but it's not necessarily bad. That's what I mean by culture. That's what I mean by this sort of thing. So if we can get that into whatever these workforces are, whatever these pockets you're talking about, then I do believe that the mechanisms and the online opportunities are there. But, you know, it's the old thing, you have to be able to realize that you need help, and you're, you know, from your analogy there. So in other words, if I don't realize that change is going to happen, then I can put all the online coursework, I can put all these wonderful things we've been talking about, and, you know, make them available to people, but they won't take advantage of it. So I think that is a key aspect of it. I think the other aspect in terms of, which is peripheral to what you talked about, is it's not just the individual. As businesses, we need to be thinking as to what is the impact of these automation technologies to our customers of the future. Because let's say that I am, whatever business I'm in, I'm selling something to an individual, but that person's role is morphed now, and and the thing doing their job is now a machine. Well, they're not going to buy that same thing, right? So I need to future-proof what I do. So I'm going to stretch this analogy, but just to, you know, I'm making cheese, but and I'm selling it because there are 50 people who come and do this sort of role, and they have you know, sandwiches with cheese at lunch. But if their jobs get morphed such that they're doing something else, that they don't come here anymore, and that job is being done by a machine, that machine isn't going to buy your cheese, right? Yeah. So to I don't know. so not yet, exactly. But so the question is, we need to be thinking about that as well from the point of view, not just what does it do to our employees, but what does it do to our customers, and then by abstraction, are we future-proofing what we do?
Jen, when you look at employees and sort of what they want, picking, you know, what they're demanding, what they're craving, what they're asking for in terms of skills, what do they see as the biggest thing that they would like their employees, their businesses, to take responsibility in terms of upskilling, in terms of opportunity, in terms of movement? What are they craving to be able to seize on the opportunities that do exist?
I think what was seen is they want that constant learning. They want to be in an environment where they feel like their job's not going to go away. And I think the challenge today is the communication piece. As the jobs are changing, people are feeling at risk, like they're no longer going to be a part of that future or that bigger picture and where things are going. And so it's change management, right? You think about, we should, as organizations, start talking about this before the change is happening and start educating not only the employees, but their managers, right? And the people that are directing them, so that they're having these conversations continuously. 65% of the jobs by 2030 that will exist do not exist today. So back to your point of, we have to ensure that we are...
Wait, let's just break that down. 60% of the jobs that exist today, you mean in types of jobs?
Meaning this, yes, meaning the jobs that will be available in 2030, 60% of those jobs do not exist today.
Right.
Which means that agility and constant learning and learnability and ability to learn new skills and the ability to want to learn new skills and the online training and everything that you need to actually be successful, we need to move quick.
But just to draw on this a little bit more, statistics like that, you hear them all the time, and they're actually, if you parse them, quite mind-boggling when you think of the scale of the challenge ahead of us, particularly in STEM, given the, you know, talent pipeline. I mean, how can companies even really seize that in terms of thinking ahead and shape-changing their, future-proofing their labor force, future-proofing their strategy? Do you feel hopeful that this change is coming?
Well, I'm hopeful for many reasons. One is, while sitting here today talking about this, and not only talking about it, but talking about execution, right? So back to the point that was made 5 years ago, it wasn't execution, it was, is this a problem?
Right.
Think of how far we've came in 5 years.
Right.
the efforts that we're doing in Minnesota with the CIOs from these big corporations, we're sitting in a room and we're executing, right? We're looking at how do we join the Million Women Mentors efforts, and we're talking about how do we execute, not is there a problem or talk about the actual challenges, it's the solutions. And everybody sitting in this room is solutioning. So I feel good.
Solutioning. Okay, well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to do a quick lightning round, starting with you, Matt, back there. One trend or change you can see in the labor force that could end with better than expected adaptation, change, disruption in terms of STEM, and one thing that concerns you.
So I think in terms of things which could turn out better than expected, I would focus on the notion of when we can repackage learning in more efficient forms so that people can acquire them and bridge. I think actually we're going to find that people are going to have an infrastructure for acquiring skills more efficiently, more effectively, and on a lifelong basis. Learning is a unique opportunity that both employers and workers have to arbitrage, for people to arbitrage in themselves, for employers to arbitrage in their own human capital, right? If I'm a graphic designer and I make $54,000, by learning web development, I make $76,000, right? So it doesn't cost $22,000 to learn web development. And I think there's going to be a lot more, and there's a lot of really great experiments that are already bringing new efficiency to that. In terms of things that concern me, I think it really comes back to this question of signaling and how transparent and what kind of infrastructure we provide for our employees, for students, learners, workers, to see where demand is going to be in the future, so that they can future-proof themselves and acquire skills that will be valuable to themselves and to their employers and to the economy.
Jane?
I think the most promising thing that I've seen in companies all across the country is the new concept of teamwork, multi-generational teams, multi-talent teams. I think it's really exciting way to solve problems and to approach solutions. The challenge, I think the one thing that remains a challenge to me is student debt. I mean, I just don't know what happens to learners of all ages as they walk out of school at 22 or 60 with 40, 50, 60, $100,000 in debt. I don't know how our economy survives that. So I think we really have to take a serious look at cost sharing in the cost of higher education and continuing education.
Krishna?
You know, I think there is cause for optimism in the sense that they're increasingly seeing role models who are very successful, right, in this space, which I think will encourage kids and youth to sort of pursue careers in this space. I think it is much more visible just with the internet, with everything that's going on, and that whole thing. People want to be the next Bill Gates or Zuckerberg or whatever it is,
Sheryl
right?
Sandberg.
So, and I think what sort of gives me pause a little bit is sometimes that these things are also high profile. If you think of artificial intelligence, for example, things will go wrong. Things will go wrong. And I think we need to be mindful of the fact that you can't just sort of retrench completely, because there will be high profile things and you don't want that to sort of be to stigmatize STEM, or, you know, here, we always told you so, right? Now let's go back to our caves, sort of thing.
We don't want to go back to our caves, right, John? And for you?
I think, once again, going back to the positive is that all the corporations and the employees and the next generation, the millennials that were here on the panel, are all talking about it and connecting, right? And so that's positive. I think one of the challenges is going to be can we move as quickly as we need to move with how quickly things are changing?
This is true. Personal story, I have a 2-year-old, and I just gave her a electrical circuit set. So I'm trying to keep her from being a psych major or a liberal arts major already too. This has been a great discussion. Matt, Jane, Krishna, Jen, thank you so much for joining. Thank you guys so much for having us. Edie, especially, big shout out to you. So thank you guys, and I think we're moving into the next panel. Thank you guys so much.
Very, very nicely done.